How many times can a country lose its entire leadership before it stops being an event and starts being a pattern? Iran has now answered that question 3 times in 9 months, and each answer got darker than the last. Before we go further, if you want to see stories like this one the moment they drop, hit subscribe now, tap the like button so more people see this, and send this video to one person who still thinks this war ended after 12 days. Let's get into it. On the night of February 28, 2026, Israeli warplanes dropped roughly 30 bombs on a compound in Tehran. Inside that compound was Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, sitting with his most trusted commanders. Israeli intelligence had reportedly tracked this meeting for weeks, waiting for the exact moment when the largest possible number of senior officials would be gathered in one place at one time. That moment came, and within 60 seconds, 40 senior Iranian officials were dead. Sit with that number for a second. 40 people, 60 seconds. That is not a lucky hit. That is not a missile that happened to land in the right spot at the right time. To kill that many senior officials in under a minute, you need to know exactly who is in that room, exactly when they will be there, and exactly how to strike before a single one of them can run for the door. This wasn't guesswork. This was months, maybe years, of watching, listening, and waiting for the one night when everyone important would be under the same roof at once. Among the confirmed dead that night were the commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Mohammad Pakpour, the Armed Forces Chief of Staff, Abdolrahim Musavi, the Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, Ali Shamkhani, and the country's Defense Minister, Aziz Nasirzadeh. Khamenei's own daughter, his son-in-law, and his grandchild were killed in the same strike. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't a strike that stayed inside the walls of government. It reached directly into a man's family, in the same breath that it reached into his cabinet. But the 4 names above are only the headline. The real story is buried in the roster underneath them, because it shows you this wasn't an attack on one man sitting at the top of a pyramid. It was an attack on the entire pyramid itself, all at once. The head of intelligence at Iran's Central Wartime Command Center was killed. The man who managed the supreme leader's own private military communications was killed. The current head of Iran's most secretive nuclear research body was killed, and so was the man who used to run that same body before him. That means both the present and the former chief of Iran's nuclear program died in the same operation, on the same night, in the same building. The commander of Iran's aerospace force, the branch that controls the country's missiles and drones, was killed. The head of police intelligence was killed. A senior figure inside the intelligence ministry was killed, along with 4 more officials from that same ministry whose names were never released to the public. Look closely at what that list actually covers, because it isn't random. It reads like a checklist someone built years in advance and simply waited to use. The supreme leader, his personal communications chief, his defense minister, his armed forces chief, his national security secretary, his missile commander, his police intelligence chief, both the current and former heads of his nuclear program, multiple senior intelligence officials from his own ministry. In under 60 seconds, 5 completely separate branches of Iranian power were beheaded at exactly the same time. The military, the missile and drone program, the nuclear research apparatus, domestic police intelligence, and civilian intelligence. 5 pillars, each one normally sealed off from the others by design, all collapsing together in a single subminute window. Here is what makes that so devastating, and it has almost nothing to do with the bombs themselves. Iran, like most authoritarian states, was built to survive exactly the opposite kind of attack. Its security services overlap on purpose. Its military branches compete with each other on purpose. Its intelligence agencies watch each other almost as closely as they watch outside enemies. This design is sometimes called coup-proofing, and its entire job is to stop one internal branch from ever becoming powerful enough to take down the whole regime from within. It is a defense built for a threat that comes from inside the house. That structure worked exactly as intended for decades. It survived internal rivalries. It survived power struggles between generals who despised each other. It survived attempted purges and quiet betrayals that never made international headlines. But it was never designed to survive an outside force that could strike every single branch's leadership in the same building on the same night. The redundancy that was supposed to protect the regime from itself became almost meaningless the moment an external enemy figured out how to hit all the redundant pieces at once, in the same room, before any of them even knew what was happening. There's one more name from that night that doesn't fit the military pattern at all, and it might be the most surprising detail in this entire story. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, Iran's former president, was reportedly killed in an airstrike at his own home that same day. Ahmadinejad hadn't held real power in over a decade. He was a genuinely complicated figure inside Iran's own political system, someone who had criticized the regime publicly at different points, someone who had even been barred from running for office, again by Iran's own guardian council. He was, by the time of his death, treated by many inside Iran as something closer to an aging domestic critic than a core regime insider. He wasn't hiding in a bunker that night. He wasn't sitting in a security council meeting surrounded by armed guards. He was killed at his own private residence. And that single detail tells you something important. Whoever built this target list wasn't only looking at active military commanders in uniform. They were looking at the entire architecture of Iranian power, past and present, official and unofficial, and deciding that all of it was fair game for a single night's operation. A former president with no formal title left was still worth including on a list built to erase leadership in every form it could possibly take. Now here is the detail that turns this from one shocking headline into something far bigger and far more unsettling. This was not the first time Iran's senior leadership had been wiped out this way. Go back to June 13th, 2025, during what people at the time called the 12-Day War. Israeli strikes on Tehran, and Iran's command centers killed the IRGC's commander-in-chief, Hossein Salami. They killed the armed forces chief of staff at the time, Mohammad Bagheri. They killed the commander of Iran's central wartime headquarters, Gholam Ali Rashid, and the commander of the aerospace force, Amir Ali Hajizadeh, along with 4 additional senior aerospace commanders. They also killed the head of Basiji Intelligence Protection and a deputy head of intelligence inside Iran. As law enforcement command, a nuclear physicist, the dean of the Faculty of Nuclear Sciences at Shahid Beheshti University, was killed in that very same round of strikes. Now compare that June 2025 list to the February 2026 list side by side. This is not a coincidence of similar sounding job titles landing in 2 different news cycles. This is the exact same positions being wiped out twice, with entirely different human beings sitting in those chairs each time. The IRGC's top commander was killed in June 2025, and his replacement's entire command structure was killed again 8 months later. The Armed Forces Chief of Staff followed the same exact pattern. The aerospace commander overseeing Iran's missile and drone arsenal followed the same pattern too, with a brand new commander in place by the time the second strike arrived. Even the nuclear research angle repeats itself almost perfectly. A university dean and a physicist killed in the first wave. Both the current and former heads of the dedicated nuclear research organization killed in the second. This is a war that has now proven, twice in 2 separate years, that it can reach into any specific chair of power inside Iran's government, no matter who happens to be sitting in it at the time. That single fact changes the entire meaning of the 40 deaths in February. Every one of those positions had already been wiped out once, 8 months earlier, in June 2025. That means the people killed in February weren't the original commanders at all. They were the replacements, the second generation of leaders Iran had installed specifically to recover from the first decapitation. And that second generation, the one built to prove Iran could bounce back, was wiped out too, in under a minute, on a single February night. Think about what that actually does to a country's ability to function as a state. Losing your top leadership once is a crisis that any nation can, in theory, survive. Losing it twice within 8 months, with a full and rushed changeover forced in between, is something closer to organizational collapse than a crisis. Even in a system explicitly built to survive, leadership loss, the people who step into a role right after their predecessor was just assassinated, inherit that position under enormous, almost unbearable pressure, with far less time to build the trust, the institutional knowledge, and the personal relationships that their predecessor spent years, sometimes an entire career, developing. Most militaries plan officer succession over years, even decades, deliberately grooming replacements slowly so institutional memory never truly disappears when one person leaves. Compressing that same delicate process into months, twice in a row, in the middle of active war, is close to the worst possible condition under which any organization could be expected to keep functioning at a high level. There's a smaller but equally important thread buried inside all of this, easy to miss if you're only counting names. The nuclear losses in particular are not the kind of damage that gets repaired quickly, no matter how many replacements a government can appoint on paper. A university dean and a physicist killed in 2025. Then both the current and former chairman of the actual nuclear research body killed in 2026. That pattern suggests a deliberate, sustained effort to strip away Iran's nuclear expertise at the individual human level, strike after strike, rather than a single blow aimed at one program leader. Nuclear knowledge takes years, often decades, of specialized training to build inside a single mind. It cannot simply be handed off to whoever is next in line. Losses in that category may end up outlasting almost everything else on this roster, long after the headlines have faded. If you're starting to see the shape of this pattern coming together, you're not alone, and this is exactly the kind of story we dig into every single week on this channel. If this video is opening your eyes to something you hadn't connected before now, do me a favor and drop a comment telling me which detail surprised you the most. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who need to see the full picture, not just the headline number. The story did not stop in February. And this next part is what makes the whole pattern impossible to describe as one single isolated event. On March 17, 2286, Ali Larijani was assassinated in Tehran. Larijani had become Iran's de facto overall leader, a role Khamenei had reportedly arranged for him in advance, days before his own death, just in case something happened to him first. Israel's own defense minister confirmed Larijani's death directly to the public. Iran's state news agency reported that he had been targeted while at his daughter's house in a district east of Tehran, far from any military compound or command bunker. According to tracked accounts of the strike, significant intelligence and operational resources had been specifically dedicated to locating him in the weeks beforehand. This wasn't a lucky hit on a target of opportunity who happened to step outside at the wrong moment. This was a deliberate, dedicated manhunt for the single most powerful man left standing inside Iran's entire government. The Basij Force commander, Gholamreza Soleimani, and his deputy were killed in that same operation on that very same night, as if the entire emergency chain of command had been mapped out in advance and struck all at once. To understand how significant this killing truly was, you need to understand who Larijani actually was, before any of this war even started. He wasn't some wartime appointee who got elevated suddenly because of a crisis nobody saw coming. Larijani had been one of the most recognizable and respected figures in Iranian politics for decades before any of this began. He had served as Speaker of Parliament. He had run for president multiple times over the years. He was a genuine institutional insider, a man trusted enough by Khamenei himself to be personally and specifically named in advance as the answer to one single terrifying question. What happens to this country if I am killed? That carefully prepared answer, built over years of planning inside Iran's highest levels of government, lasted less than 3 weeks in actual practice. Think about what it truly means for a country to lose its de facto national leader twice within 19 days. Larijani wasn't a minor official who simply happened to be standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was, according to Iran's own internal succession planning, the one specific man chosen to hold everything together in the exact moment continuity mattered more than at any other point in the nation's modern history. The entire purpose of that arrangement was to make absolutely sure the country didn't collapse into total chaos the instant Khamenei was gone. And that arrangement, built with such care and such secrecy, lasted less than 3 weeks before the man at the very center of it was hunted down and killed too, at his own daughter's house, of all places. That single fact tells you Israeli intelligence had penetrated Iran's emergency post-assassination leadership structure just as deeply and just as thoroughly as it had penetrated the original structure that existed before Khamenei died in the first place. 3 days later, on March 20th, the pattern continued with an entirely new set of names, and this time, the targets weren't generals standing on a battlefield. They were the people who quietly ran the internal machinery that kept the entire regime functioning day to day. Ali Mohammed Naini, the IRGC's spokesperson since 2024, and according to independent analysis, the man primarily responsible for spreading the regime's propaganda and shaping its public messaging while repeatedly issuing threats against American and Israeli interests, was killed in an airstrike. He had survived the brutal Iran-Iraq war decades earlier as a young man, only to die in this war at 69 years old, in what should have been the final chapter of a long and eventful life. Naini's death matters in a very different way than the deaths of the generals and commanders around him, because his job was never fighting. His job was talking. He was the voice millions of ordinary Iranians heard on state television night after night, the man threatening retaliation on camera, the man shaping how an entire population understood the war they were living through in real time, killing the one person whose entire function was managing public perception and controlling the nation's psychological posture, is a fundamentally different kind of blow than killing a field commander. It's a strike aimed directly at the invisible machinery that controls how tens of millions of people process their own reality, day after day, broadcast after broadcast. That same day, the intelligence chief of the Basij paramilitary organization was killed. A senior commander inside Iran's Ministry of Intelligence died alongside him in the same set of strikes. In one single afternoon, Iran lost the public face of its entire propaganda apparatus, the internal intelligence arm of its largest and most loyal paramilitary force, and a senior figure inside its civilian intelligence ministry. 3 completely separate institutional functions, each one normally isolated from the other 2 by design, collapsed together in the space of just a few hours. This all happened only 3 days after Larijani himself had been killed, which means that in less than a single week, Iran lost its de facto national leader, its Basij commander and his deputy, its IRGC spokesperson, its Basij intelligence chief, and a senior Ministry of Intelligence commander. 5 separate roles spanning political leadership, paramilitary command, public messaging, and 2 entirely distinct intelligence services, all gone within 7 days of each other, almost as if the entire month had been planned out on a single calendar in advance. There are a couple of additional names tied to this exact period that deserve an honest caveat before we move on, because not every claim in a story this large carries the same weight of certainty. Iranian opposition-aligned outlets reported the deaths of an aerospace force commander stationed in Isfahan and a cyber operative killed in Hamadan, both around this same general window of time. Those two names come from opposition-linked reporting, rather than the same level of independently confirmed wire service sourcing attached to names like Larijani or Naini, and they should honestly be read as credible but somewhat less firmly established than the rest of this list. A responsible telling of this story has to be honest about exactly where that line sits. Analysts who study this kind of institutional damage professionally reached a careful, measured conclusion about this specific stretch of killings, and it's worth including their exact judgment rather than paraphrasing it away. Their assessment was that these repeated strikes on Iran's internal security services likely caused shock and confusion inside the security apparatus and disrupted its internal operations to some degree. That is a deliberately cautious, heavily hedged statement, the kind trained analysts use when they want to stay honest about the limits of what can be proven from outside. But it lines up almost perfectly with what the raw list of names above would predict entirely on its own, without any analysis attached at all. An internal security structure that had just lost its propaganda chief, its Basij intelligence head, a senior intelligence ministry commander, and its overall Basij commander and his deputy, all within roughly a single week, is simply not a structure that can be expected to function the way it did before any of this began. Before we go any further, if this kind of deep, connected storytelling is something you genuinely want more of on this channel, subscribing costs nothing and takes about 2 seconds, and it is honestly the single best way to support work like this going forward. So if you haven't already done that, now is a good time to take care of it before we finish. Now let's put the entire picture together, because at this point, the individual numbers matter far less than the pattern quietly connecting all of them. This was not one decapitation strike that happened to be unusually large. It was at least 3 distinct waves spread out across 9 full months. June 2025, February 2026, March 2026. Each wave hit an entirely new generation of leadership occupying largely the same roles as the generation that came directly before it. The IRGC command, the Armed Forces Chief of Staff, the Aerospace and Missile Command, the Basij leadership, the intelligence and security services, over and over again, like a door that kept getting kicked back open no matter how many times someone tried to close it. Every single time Iran managed to fill a vacated position, whether through normal peacetime succession or rushed emergency wartime appointment, that new replacement became a target too, almost automatically. And in Larijani's specific case, the single most senior replacement in the entire government, the one man personally chosen in advance to hold the whole country together, was hunted down and killed within 19 days of formally taking on that responsibility. This is not a story about one dramatic night in February that happened to make headlines around the world. It's a story about a sustained, deliberate campaign built on one very specific and very cold assumption that killing the current leadership would never actually be enough on its own, because whoever stepped up to replace them would eventually need to be found and killed as well, no matter how carefully they were hidden. One honest note before we close this story out completely, because a roster spanning this many months and this many separate reports deserves to have its sourcing acknowledged plainly and openly, rather than presented as if every single detail carries identical certainty. Every name in this roster traces back to tracked lists of officials killed during the 2026 Israeli and American strikes on Iran. Wire and broadcast coverage of the February 28th strikes specifically confirmed rosters of senior military officials released in the days afterward. On the ground reporting on the exact mechanics of the opening strike itself, analytical assessments of the resulting internal security impact and opposition, aligned reporting for the small handful of names attributed specifically to that particular source. Wherever a name came from, opposition reporting alone, rather than independently corroborated wire service confirmation, that distinction was kept clear and separate throughout this video, rather than quietly blended in as though it carried equal certainty. It's also worth being upfront about the small natural inconsistencies that show up in any roster compiled from this many separate reports, translating names out of Persian script into English in real time, under serious deadline pressure across dozens of competing news organizations working independently of one another. Some names likely refer to the very same individuals under slightly different spellings, rather than representing entirely different people. So what are you actually left with once you strip away that single dramatic headline number of 40 and look at the full 9 months laid out together? You're left with something far more unsettling than any single body count could ever communicate on its own. You're left with a leadership structure that kept regenerating, and kept getting cut down again over and over for 9 straight months without ever truly stabilizing. The supreme leader and his inner circle, gone in February, in under 60 seconds. The one man specifically and personally chosen to replace him, gone by March, less than 3 weeks into the job. The propaganda chief, the Basiji intelligence apparatus, and senior intelligence ministry figures, all gone within days after that, almost as an afterthought compared to what had already happened. And somehow, through every single wave of this, Iran's government kept functioning in some form. It clearly has continued to operate. It has continued to issue public statements. It has continued to exist as a recognizable state on a map, with borders and a flag and a seat at international tables. But that continued existence is sitting directly on top of a leadership structure that has now had to rebuild itself from scratch more than once, in less total time than it takes most militaries anywhere on Earth to complete a single routine, peacetime change of command. That's the real story, hiding quietly behind the number 40, the number that made headlines around the world back in February. It was never really about one catastrophic night. It's about a government that has been forced to answer the exact same brutal question 3 separate times in less than a year. Who replaces the people who just died? And how long will they actually be allowed to survive in that chair before someone comes for them too? And that raises a much harder question than any single roster of names ever could. What does leadership even mean inside a system, where the chair itself has become the target rather than the person sitting in it? In most governments, a title carries a certain kind of permanence. A commander expects to command for years. A minister expects to shape policy over a career, not a matter of weeks. But inside Iran's government right now, every title on that org chart has effectively become a countdown clock. The moment someone accepts a promotion into one of these roles, they step into a position that has already proven twice that it does not protect the person filling it. It only marks them. Think about what that does to the officials still standing inside that structure today, the ones who haven't been named on any list yet, quietly running departments and command posts across Iran right now. Every single one of them knows, with total certainty, that their predecessor in nearly every senior position across the government was hunted down and killed, sometimes twice over. That is not the kind of knowledge that builds confidence. It changes how a person makes decisions, how quickly they move, how much they trust the people around them, and how willing they are to gather in the same room as their colleagues, even for something as routine as a briefing. There is a quieter cost buried inside all of this that rarely makes it into any headline. It's the cost of constant, low-level fear operating inside the highest levels of a government trying to run a country during wartime. Decisions that should take hours might now take days, because the people making them are working from hidden locations instead of proper command centers. Meetings that should happen in person may now happen in fragments, through intermediaries, because gathering too many senior officials in one place has already proven fatal 3 separate times. An institution operating under that pressure doesn't just lose people. It loses speed, it loses clarity, and it loses the confident decision-making any government needs most during exactly the kind of crisis Iran has been living through for the better part of a year. And that brings us back to the real weight of this story, the part that goes far beyond any single name on any list. This wasn't just a war, fought with missiles and airstrikes against buildings and equipment. It was a war fought against the very idea of leadership itself, waged again and again against whoever happened to be standing in a specific chair at a specific moment, regardless of who that person actually was. 3 times in 9 months, Iran rebuilt its leadership from almost nothing. 3 times, that rebuilt structure was found, and 3 times, it was taken apart again. The question this leaves behind isn't really about how many people were killed. It's about how much longer any government could keep functioning under that same pressure before the entire structure simply stops being able to hold itself together at all. So far, across 3 separate waves and 9 straight months, the answer keeps coming back exactly the same way, every single time. Not very long at all.